The land, the animals, and the people. Welcome to the Wolf Connection Podcast.
We spoke with Rosie Sanchez recently, and she gave me the pleasure and the connection of one of the Nez Perce tribe's tribal members so that we can really dive into the cultural aspect of some of the things we couldn't touch on with her. And very honored to be joined this morning by one of those members. He's been with the tribe for roughly 13 or 14 years, and has had a lot of training in environmental sciences, tribal community engagement, and as a rural environmental sociologist. He's James Holt. James, it's a pleasure to meet you, and really looking forward to diving into these issues and these conversations with you. How are you doing this morning?
Good. It's good to be here, and I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you today.
Absolutely. It's always good to get the perspective from the tribe and to really dive deeper into the meaning about the ecology of the land, the animals, of course, and what it means. Just go into your upbringing. I was doing a little bit of research about your background, and you really seemed to have a connection to the land early on in your childhood. Just tell everybody what that was about and how that played into your childhood.
Definitely. From my earliest memories was being on the river or loading up the pickup truck and going out and camping. And there was times when I was growing up where we would pack a whole bunch of water and gas on our vehicle, and we'd be out there for weeks. We would spend time out there in the mountains, and we wouldn't see another human the whole time we were out there. And that came with all the teaching us about our stewardship, about our place, giving us that ethic that we have to make things better. And that was my dad in a nutshell, giving us that traditional and cultural upbringing with ceremony and prayer, but also with those practical relationships with the land itself, with our Mother Earth, with the different wildlife species that we had a relationship with. So it was a pretty critical time and upbringing that he provided for us in this kind of modern day that we have, being able to spend so much time there on the land and going to different places to learn different landscapes here in Nez Perce country. We have such a huge, diverse landscape that it was important for him to take us to all of them and let us know, what life is like there. And my grandfather was definitely a man of the river. If there was a salmon or a steelhead run there, you could find him on it. And it was amazing, to think back. It's amazing to me to have that knowledge that my parents would take me out of school, and some of my education, as it were, was spending that time with my grandfather, my namesake, and being there with him one-on-one so he could, tell me stories, let me know different places on the river and what they used to be, and, that we should still go to those places and exercise that relationship that has been given to us, since time immemorial. And, I do my best to carry those traditions on and give those to my children as well.
Talk about the education aspect of it, because it really does seem in this modern time we've lost that education with the natural world. So what were some of the things that your father and your grandfather were educating you about, just in terms of the landscape and the wildlife that you were in for up to a month's time? And what were the teachings like? What was that education like for you?
Those formative years, learning the role of different insects, or the not so much their role at times, but what they signified to us. Like, oh, look, there's look at that insect and how far it is above the water, how far it's flying their paths, to notice the different layers of when they would drop down to the water and what that meant, or when different birds migrated back to the homelands, what that entailed for us, and the different weather patterns, and knowing how we fit into those and what tomorrow might look like. And so just, getting your cues from the all all facets of the environment, from the smallest beings on up to the largest, macro climate approach, looking at things from that 10,000-foot view, understanding that ecology is landscapes, and really trying to ensure that I was taught, what's there and also what's not there, the absence of wolves, knowing that a lot of, the teachings could have went to the wayside because, we didn't have those practical relationships anymore. And that was definitely true with like buffalo and, the re-energization of that relationship between the Nez Perces and buffalo. So I think that it taught me a lot. It showed me that, those relationships we have from with the insects, birds, plants, that's still practical today, that we still need to rely on those signs, and we need to, allow those species to persist as well. We have a job to do. And I think that was probably the biggest thing my dad taught me was, of all these things, it's your job to caretake for them, because I'm out here teaching you everything they do for us. But that's what's unsaid here is like for everything, you have a responsibility to the collective, to all of them. They may only do one thing for you or for the environment, but it's your job to speak for all of them.
Talk about that as it relates to the tradition of hunting and fishing, because that seemed to really resonate in your bio when I was reading it, that you were taught these things early on. What is the relationship when it comes to, as you were saying, you're caretaking for all of these things that are on the land? How does that resonate within your knowledge and history of what that means to caretake and take in a way that is responsible for the land?
Yeah. In in some of our traditional religions, we call it Walasset. And in that religious way, we are taught that, to the ceremonies are often began with water, and as we eat our foods, they're laid out in a certain way, and it was the way that was given to us from the beginning, before human beings came. The creator, our creator, he called every being together, and he said, human beings are coming, and what are you going to do for them? And they got in line, and they all came forward. The first one to come forward was salmon, and then then deer came forward, elk, on down the line. And when that was all done, creator said, this is good, but the human beings, as I just kind of detailed, have a sacred obligation, because you're doing these things for humans when they come. You're obligated as a human being to caretake for all these things, that all these beings who are stepping forward for you. That's why we advocate so hard for clean water, for salmon. They were the first to come forward for us, to give everything about them to us. So that's kind of like a flavor of like the level of how important it is for us to speak for clean water and the environment. It's a sacred responsibility that our creator gave us. It's, excuse me, we refer to it in our language as halal halal tamalwit, that invisible law that was given to us in the very beginning of time. And we still take that ethic seriously, that, and it means an active relationship, and that often throws people off. Water, salmon, deer, elk, buffalo, they said they would give themselves to us and provide something. but that also means that we have to have that relationship with them. We have to hunt them, and we have to have ceremony with that, and that ties us together because we're only going to go as far as those species do. When the last salmon is gone, so will the last Nez Perce. We believe that. So, we fight as if our future and advocate as if our future was on the line. We believe it is. So, that's why we act the way we do. And that's why we want the healthy forests. That's why every being has its role, and we cannot replace that. And often, we see in this modern time where it kind of sometimes seems like humans are trying to, they're trying to replicate and replace the role of predators like the wolf. And, we're failing.
Talk about that relationship with the wolf, because you spoke beautifully about the species that came forward to give themselves to humans so that they could survive and then hopefully reciprocate that with ceremony. I know the wolf, or just talk about what the wolf meant in this setting and how it was bonded with humans from that time.
Yeah, wolf has always been a guide for us. He showed us a lot of things when we first came to this, to be who we are here on this land. We didn't know a lot about this modern world, and you look at that geologic record, that anthropologic and cultural record, and that'll tell you that the Nez Perces have been here on the landscape for over 14,000 years. Since before that last ice bridge in that last ice age, we were already here. So we literally watched and helped this entire ecosystem come into being as we know it today here in our homeland. We watched it. We watched mastodons, prehistoric buffalo, the saber-toothed tiger. We have these in our oral histories. And so, we used fire in a cultural way to help, the habitats of these beings. We watched the beaver go from a 8 to 10 feet behemoth down to what we know today. And so, that comes with a lot of knowledge, and a lot of the history to watch it. And so in that way, we watched wolves. We needed their guidance. They had to show us that, hey, if you go for the weak ones or the sick ones, you're probably going to have a greater chance of providing, and when the wolves hunted, we followed them. We knew where the game were by where the wolves were. And when they moved off to a different area, we knew we'd probably have to move off that way too to stay healthy ourselves. So that, there was um, very loose but definite symbiotic relationships with wolves. They did a lot for us. They kept these species that we relied upon healthy as well. They were caretakers of the deer and the elk, ensuring that they were healthy and strong, ensuring that they had their role filled. So, it was definitely an important thing for us. And to have that element of guidance, of strength, of power, you would take that name, to show that you were a teacher that way, that you would take care of everybody. If you were the leader, you had to take care of everybody. Just like the wolf, the leader of the wolf pack, he takes care of everybody. He nurtures all the children along.
We, are humans the children in this aspect? Because it really seems as though the wolf is the teacher and is guiding. Was there, it didn't seem like there was a burden for the wolf at this point. It was almost as though it was their role or their mission to be the guides in this scenario. Was that always how it's been put down in oral history, that the wolf was really took this on with no burden to be the guide?
Well, the wolf, as with humans, are many things. Other times they can be a little greedy. They want all the food. They want that food. They could be jealous. So there's other things that a wolf could be, that we can see actually on the landscape. When you watch a pack move around, you see these attributes come out. And, wolves have always been known to be that way. They haven't changed. And so the nature of the wolf, is often the nature of us all. And we could take, lessons from how they are. And so I believe that, different beings provide different lessons for us that way. And, it's important for us to reflect on what Wolf is doing as he's, taking care of his family and his pack, and how he goes about his hunts and where he goes. That's all important stuff.
When you say, or when we do this at the sanctuary as well, because we share the stories of the wolf dogs that come to us, we talk about that reflection and looking back almost at ourselves. Is that something that is done within the tribe? Because I know there are certain tribal members that get the name wolf put in their name. What is the process for that, and why does that happen? Is it because of their attributes? Why do certain members get wolf put in their name and others not?
In this day and age, sometimes it's how would you say, hereditary, like, that great chief or that great warrior or that great woman leader from throughout history, was so important that we couldn't let that name die. And so they passed it down through generations. And other times it was definitely that, where you went to that mountaintop and you had that spiritual journey. And while you were there, the wolf came to you in your vision and let you know that he would give you his strength and vision and guidance in a certain way. And, then you took that name. So there's definitely a few different ways that you could get that name. And if it was given to you in a dream or a vision, you definitely had something, a part of you. And often that's an intimate thing. That's a personal thing where I'm going to tell you generically that I saw a wolf, but I'm not going to break it down for you because that's between me and my creator. He gave me this, it came to me for this, and I don't want to share it with anybody.
That's such a special, unique experience. I can only fathom that's what that would be. Is there guidance from that vision that you can speak to, that or any individuals that you may know that they feel tasked with certain jobs or passing of stories that they saw in this vision, or something to that nature? Or is it simply just, I have to do what the vision told me, and I won't explain that with anyone. I have to go on my own path. How does that work, if you can explain that at all?
I think even then it's different for every individual. For me, um, it's just like saying you have to be a certain way. You have to live a certain way. And when you go about your life, you have to speak for these things, and that's what you will do. So for me, it's very transparent that way. I'm doing it. I'm like, I'm fulfilling everything I was told to do. And for others, they might not be so bold and clear about it. It could be something different. So you're right. It's different for every individual. You can't really say how it applies or shakes out in their lives, and they'll be guided by it in, a very intimate way.
The Wolf Connection podcast is now sponsored by our new partner, Jacques-Marie Mage. This LA-based brand is known for their limited edition, handcrafted eyewear and luxury goods, but also for their stewardship program, which supports various nonprofits and individuals who are working to protect a future for wild wolves.
Discuss too, because you've laid out the beautiful history of the Nez Perce and these relationships with nature and wolves and bison and all these prehistoric and these other creatures that no longer roam. I looked on the website and I saw that there are comparisons with wolves and bison, and they're almost extirpation to the same feelings of the Nez Perce when the Euro-American expansion happened. Discuss or just describe that for those who are listening, and why there is such a parallel with those extirpations and the Nez Perce being pushed off their land and those things being split up from them.
Yeah. Being a native person and looking back through history, it's dark, and there's some aspects that are very dark for us, and it's difficult to talk about sometimes. When we talk about buffalo and wolves and grizzly bears, and salmon, all these beings that were, our food source or our guides, and to see them, purposely, trying to be killed off for, the needs of the year Americans, their wants, the fears, those fears of not knowing what the ways of this new land, when we had lived alongside them for eons. That was a difficult thing because that happened to the tribes as well. We are a remnant population now because of, if you look at the census, I mean, indigenous people should be the top population in their homeland, but we are often less than 1%, less than 2% of the population in the United States now. So the extirpation of wolves and buffalo was always also the extirpation of indigenous peoples. And so, we've struggled since those times. For us, instance, the Nez Perces, we've struggled since the Nez Perce War and those smallpox epidemics to regain our footing, and it's taken us decades and decades, over a century, to get back to that. And now here we are, taking our place, assuming that sovereignty, wanting to co-manage, reintroducing endangered species back to the landscape. It's taken a long time for us to get to this point. And and I think that's why we are so strongly in support of wolves and buffalo and grizzlies. We know their role, we know what they do, and we see how sick the land is getting. And we have to empower us all, because even within the indigenous peoples, we have a role. And it's important for us to be able to assume that responsibility for the natural world.
If you can speak to this, why do you think there was such a disparity in thought process of the caretaking of the land and choosing maybe fear, as you described, over partnership and communing with the land in a way that would provide or supply for all, as opposed to extirpate and get out of the way and use and use and use until there was almost nothing left? Why do you think there was such a disparity there in that fraught history?
Yeah, I definitely think that's a cultural difference, a religious and cultural difference. You have this Europeans who come in who, you know, I'm not well versed in this, but I think the landscape there in Europe was very tamed, by the time that they started migrating to the United States, to Americas. And even religiously, they have that, it was given to us to dominate. Everything is given to us to hold dominion over. And that's much different than you know, the humans came and now you have a responsibility to everything. The dichotomy there is just like 180. We're here for everybody on Mother Earth versus we want to dominate everything on Mother Earth that's not human. So I, I I think that was a lot, especially the fear. The wolves still roamed. They were probably extirpated in Europe by then. All the major predators were probably gone, and they came here, and grizzlies themselves were all over the country. So were the wolves. And I'd imagine the livestock even then was probably easy pickings for them. There were so many of them that probably did stoke fear. And maybe some learned responses from that European history predating that to even hundreds of years before that, before they came here. So I think it was definitely a learned and lived environment that has created all this conflict or differences of how to live and coexist on the landscape.
What can you share about how the Nez Perce are able to live or was able to coexist and still are with these larger predators, because it seems as though there's always this thought of competition that, and as you say, dominance. What is the difference in that teaching that you were brought up with to coexist with something that you could live alongside, learn to hunt from, and also understand their balance within this ecosystem as a megafauna that is a predator?
I think that kind of what you're getting at is that we've been here so long. We were accustomed to seeing different beings in different places over time, and and as those populations changed, we were tuned into those conditions. We knew where the robust herds were versus those that maybe had a tough winter, and we should probably stay away from them. Um, that was a big thing. I want to say that I hope that we were stewards enough to say that, oh no, the wolf population is going away, and if we keep hunting over there, they might not have enough food. So we have to ourselves become, um, how should I say this? We have to be stewards enough to know that if we go in there, we're going to impact it, and that flies in the face of everything we were taught. So we have to understand that we're not just taking for ourselves, we're taking as a part of a community that is there in the landscape, and we can only take our portion. And that was very true with many things. Like we couldn't just go to a random field of camas and dig roots. We had to go to the local chief there and say, hey, can we dig some of your roots? And he'd be like, okay, you can dig some, not that much. We already went through there, or not that one because it's been hammered too much. Go over there. You can dig some of those. So, we were always directed to the strongest resources and away from those that were scarce. And I think that holds true even today. My dad and my uncle back in the 70s used to go and fish all the way up until then at this place called the Blue Hole on the Imnaha River in Northeast Oregon. And one year they went back, and I want to say it was in 74 or 75, and there were hardly any salmon there. And so they told themselves, we can't come back here until the salmon come back. And they never fished there again. They never were able to go back. And so, we take this seriously. We know that we have to speak for all species, and that, um, we have to do what's right by them. And often that means curtailing our own life ways or our own needs to provide for them.
It's such a unique and really worldly perspective to take, in that we are all impacting the land at some point or another. And it's really about showing control, from what you're saying, and understanding to let some things recoup in order for those things to continue to stay healthy and not just bleed it dry until it's gone. You mentioned your relationship with, obviously, the wolf and the extirpation and things that happened. Talk about the reintroduction to Idaho, because that was such a really vital point, not only in, I would say American recovery conservation history, but for the Nez Perce and their involvement in the wolves coming back to Idaho. Describe what that was like to be able to really be at the forefront of this incredible achievement.
Yes. The Nez Perce had always been in favor of that reintroduction. We missed that presence, and it got to the point where we didn't even could only speak to the thought of that relationship because they had been gone for so many decades. So we pushed the feds, the Fish and Wildlife Service, to do what is right, Idaho, on the other hand, was like, no, we are not going to be a part of anything like that. And there's no way. So the Nez Perce were like, we'll do it. We have a plan. And they were still reluctant. Our chairman went and spoke, and they were still on the fence. And it was a very impassioned speech by my elder, who since passed away, Levi Holt, who spoke before that Senate committee and really kind of like swayed them to understand our perspective enough to know, okay, this tribe does have the capacity and the heart and the understanding to do this, and we should give it to them. And that was a powerful time. Yeah, to be able to recover those wolves, to see them back on the landscape. That not too long after 1995 was when I was elected to tribal council, and it was something to be able to have our wolf biologists come to our meetings and inform us on the movements, the growth, how we utilize that coexistence, non-lethal controls to ensure the wolves were expanding to where they should, and minimizing conflict with ranchers. And it was a great thing, and it was so great that the state didn't like it. They had to get back in the middle of it, and it was more or less torn from our hands. There was no equitable or just transition. It was just taken from us because they didn't like our success. And now we see where that's gotten us. There's no science behind the state management, and their population is plummeting. And so, that's definitely shows the dichotomy of how we see wolves and the relationship that we should have.
Does it go back to what we talked about earlier about fear, and about, even if it's not fear based on the animal, the fear of success and the fear of possibility of having that relationship again? Do you think that factors in at all in some of these?
I think there's a little fear. I also think there's a whole lot of, I can't even think of the word right now. I think it goes back to the religious ethic a little bit with the dominion over things. And I feel it's odd that a rancher would be so irresponsible to throw an entire herd of cattle out onto this public land, this national forest, this wild place, and then walk away and come back and months later and pick them up. And that's kind of the nature of a lot of our ranching operations on national forest land. There's no stewardship. There's no responsibility. They just more or less say it's the irresponsible wolf who was out there messing with their cattle who were brought in. And I think that's a failure. The ranchers really do need to be more active with their livestock instead of having that impetus and that responsibility fall on wolves who are just doing what wolves do and acting in the nature of the wolf. So, yeah, there's a lot of difference there. There's that cultural difference is huge. That religious background, I think, is significant, and it does create different conditions on the ground versus what we did for coexistence measures versus what they are doing with just giving the rancher all the power in this situation.
Talk about some of those measures that you and the tribe use. What are some things, techniques, and knowledge that could be passed to individuals that they could use for coexistence, to make sure that there is balance, and they're still able to have their herds and do the things they need to do?
Stewardship, I believe, is full time. Be out there with your herd. Don't take the summer off. Go out there with your herd and be close to them. Have dogs out there with them so that they can, protect your livestock. Set up temporary fences at nighttime when the majority of any kind of wolf conflicts could be when they're hunting the most. There's practical measures and today the technology is even more advanced where they have fox lights and they have sound that can be used on top of that. And, I've seen the studies now where those ranchers who take those proactive coexistence measures minimize their fatalities to wolves. And one rancher is right in the middle of wolf packs, and he's not hardly losing any livestock versus the guy that has his right next to his own property and is losing them because he just puts them out there and does nothing. So it's definitely a responsibility, but you have to have people out there. You have to have people, boots on the ground.
That seems to be really the sentiment for a lot of the conversations we've had, is to be, as you say, a steward of your herd, be a steward of the land itself. I want to talk about your role as an environmental sociologist, because I looked up the definition of it, but you have had such a wonderful life experience that you could probably explain it to me better. So what is an environmental sociologist do, or what is their role, your role specifically, in natural resources and implementation of those things?
Yeah, historically, my role, and in the past, my role is really focused on who are the players in these conflicts or in these management paradigms. What is their focus? What is their policy? How has that played out on the ground? And and what is the thoughts of the people they represent? It's a very diverse, it's very complex. Every issue is a little different, so it's important to ascertain all those things. And I believe that provides a foundation to develop, proactive and collaborative solutions to some of these natural resource or wildlife management conundrums. We have to understand each other. As I was saying before, it's taken us decades to achieve this capacity. And now that we're here, we understand that no one's leaving. The Euro Americans are not going to jump on a ship and go back to Europe. And we're sure as heck aren't going to leave. This is our homeland. We were made here. So we have to do something about that in a good way. And I hope that that's been my role, is to help bridge those gaps and forge relationships where it was practical, and state where it wasn't, so that we could, ensure our integrity is maintained during those processes.
What are sort of the key factors or ideas that, when you look at the modern conservation aspect, when you look at some of the things that you're doing, climate change planning, wilderness management, water and natural resource policy, how are you looking to use some of your knowledge of the land and of your teaching and bring those into the modern world, so that there is this melding of ideas and you can have the best possible outcomes for the broader environmental policies that are put out there?
Yeah, definitely. I think my lived experience, along with my professional and educational background, um, it does allow me to more fully discuss the Nez Perce experience on our landscape since time immemorial. I think often that is lost or minimized in these arenas. Being able to articulate that in a way that is meaningful to these professionals across the table, um, has been proven critical, time and time again. Like it is important that we move beyond, anecdotes, to show that this relationship was in fact true, that what we're saying is in fact practical and real. And so they have to understand that we have these real relationships with wolf, with buffalo, and that we have to exercise that relationship. And it could be dichotomous to the person who doesn't understand it. You're saying that you honor buffalo, but you went over there and shot one. Explain that one. And we've had that debate over time. Like, well, it is meaningful to us. And being able to articulate those things in these policy arenas, in these management arenas, it does reemphasize that our lifeways are still here. That even though I'm wearing the latest fabrics with the latest technologies, that our culture is still what it always has been. We just embrace technology as we always have, as Nez Perce and indigenous people. So we've stayed true to our teachings. We stayed true to who we are. We just do it with this modern day, technologies and mindset that we have.
It's the evolution of us as a people and Nez Perce as a tribe. I mean, there's no reason to not evolve and not use the latest tools to be able to make these policies enact themselves in a way that help everyone across the land. I think that's the major goal, at least from my perspective, is to make sure, as you say, to be collaborative, to be inclusive, to share everyone's voice, and so that we are able to put forth the best policy possible that can help everyone out and keep the balance and possibly expand and make things, I'm not saying go back to the way they used to be 14,000 years ago. That would be pretty amazing if we could get there, but somehow get on the train of expanding our natural places as opposed to having them shrink. Talk more about that and building those relationships inside, intergovernmental and all these different, state, federal agencies. Are you working on those types of things, and how challenging can that be for you when working on these types of these policies or these acts and things of that sort?
Yeah, the willingness of some other actors in those arenas is it's on the spectrum as well. Some are very willing to work with the tribe while others are against it from the beginning. And what I've seen is that when you include tribes from the beginning, you co-create the science, you co-create the policy in a way that is inclusive from the start. And often with like federal processes, like with the Fish and Wildlife Service, they will, develop a foundation or a basic structure, and then they will fill in some gaps, and then they'll present that to like the Nez Perce saying, we have this now plug into it. When they've already enacted, things that could be, in conflict with our suggestions or diminish the resource in a way that they haven't foreseen or just fall short. Like what you're saying or doing is just not even close to what should be done for that species. And so, but by engaging with us early and often, I believe that is just the best way to be inclusive. That's the way to hash out where we can meet, because science these days it's almost always mixed with the needs of those people who live there, and I think that's right as well. The local counties, the towns that reside next to these large landscapes, their voices have to be heard. They have needs, and they're practical and they're important. So having us all at the table early allows people to say, okay, the tribe has lifeways here, and they have science and cultural knowledge that can lend to this. And it doesn't have to be adversarial, but it is when we're involved late. It often turns into litigation and conflict, and I don't think that benefits very many people these days. Why come from a place of conflict and adversary when we could really come together and I think it's some of that is even historic. Like we get back to this, we have the town of Lewiston, Idaho, right nearby, Grangeville, Idaho. These towns were created as squatter villages, illegal settlements. No one likes to hear that term, illegal settlements, but that's what they were at one time. And so we have that mentality of like, okay, we went and we took this land, and we don't like the Indians because we took it before we could actually be here. And then we have this kind of culture where some of the people who dislike us the most are the ones that live right off the reservation. And so it gets really hard to work with those entities. And, we can do better by getting involved earlier and really setting the appropriate foundation in place. And that's the difficulty there is Some processes are made to do that while others aren't, and there's no unification.
What would be some of the ways to establish a different foundation? What are some things you could bring to the table as the Nez Perce that would maybe build, I'm not going to say better, but a more cohesive foundation? Aside from inclusiveness, what are some of the things that might be missing in your eyes that could create a more stable and inclusive foundation for all these things from the start, as opposed to being involved late?
I would say it's because what we could bring to the table is managing and restoring while at the same time using and 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 being able to use. We also believe that we are people who use, that thing, that resource, that tree or that water source. We're users of it as well. So we understand that, as you said earlier, we all have an impact on these, whether it's a tree, a forest, a water body, uh, a wildlife species. We have an impact. And how did the indigenous people, have these robust populations while maintaining that impact? And I think that we could talk about that and parcel these things out in a way that says, rancher, we're not here to kill your lifestyle or to take away from your wallet. We're here to tell you there's better ways to do the things that you do to make it where their lives out there on the land are better. And you can still have your cake and eat it too. I mean, it's, that we can create that condition, but people have to, I guess, have an awareness that we can bring these things to the table.
Are some of the methods that may be lost is just because we've had this beautiful discussion about relationship? Is there a way to incorporate, whether it's storytelling along with scholastic, along with history, to encompass the entire picture that could promote these types of relationships even further, to have a well-rounded base of knowledge, history, story, relationship, and getting actually out into the land that maybe some of these folks might not have the opportunity to do, but need the opportunity to go and see how everything functions on the landscape?
I definitely think that would be an eye opener for a lot of people to provide that awareness of what we do provide and how we do it. Because right now it's just an unknown. I believe that when I go into these arenas, the majority of people are open-minded. The majority of people do want to know and understand the tribal perspective, how tradition and culture play into that, and what this ecological knowledge could actually bring and apply to that issue that we're discussing. And there's always going to be that small percentage that is not. And I think that's what makes it tough at times is, being able to move beyond the naysayers, because they also be gatekeepers. And so, in my experience, that that want to be inclusive, that want to collaborate, that want to at least know across the table what they're thinking, is growing. I feel like it's growing. There's counties on the reservation where we've had horrible relationships with, and that's changing. We're having improved relationships. We're working closer together here on the reservation, let alone out there in the broader homelands of the usual and the custom areas. And so, we just have to keep trudging forward and keep telling our story, because our oral histories and even the coyote stories, they're full and rich with knowledge and the way things are, the way things came to be, and that knowledge is still pertinent. We need to know those things to help restore some of these things back, if that's our goal, and it should be. We should be striving to restore and to improve and to reintroduce. That should be our mission. And it is good to see that more and more people want to engage with the tribe in that way.
You sort of answered the next question I had, but that's what I was getting to is what is the long-term sustainable future look like from your perspective, from the tribe's perspective? Is it, as you say, expansion of the obviously preservation, conservation, reintroduction, but also the possibility of expanding these populations and these lands and restoring things to a place where they're healthy again or healthier than they are right now?
Yes, definitely. We see the population of wolves in Idaho dropping. There have been illegal wolf killings in Northeast Oregon where there's other wolves that have expanded from the ones we introduced, and that's in our homeland. And we have a problem with that. So, there's we have to bring them back. We have to reintroduce the grizzly bear. We have to bring salmon populations back to a more self-sustaining threshold. We're not there yet. There's too many species that are on the endangered species list here at home. And now we have, logging has picked up. I'm seeing just within the last few months of certain executive orders, I've seen logs come off those mountains and those forests, the size of which I haven't seen in many years, many, many years. So they're cutting the old growth now. And so that just, it adds to what we will have to restore and protect in the future. So, we're kind of going backwards, and, the work for our future generations, I'm nervous about it because we have a warming planet. We have to address that climate change. We have to protect our waterways and our watersheds. We need beaver so bad. He's going to help save us in our future generations. So, we have to do better for the water. We have to bring back all these keystone species and those that nurture these environments along and can construct them back to how they were if they were damaged so heavily that they need that full restoration. We need the species that can do that. And I hope that we can get there sooner rather than later.
What would you be sharing, or what is the tribe sharing from their own biologists, from their bios to everyone else? Are they sharing these implications? Are they showing all of these detrimental aspects that are happening? How is that being received, and how are those future generations of bios in the tribe being taught to share their research so that it does get out there, so it does become public? Not that it isn't, but so that it's at the forefront of these endeavors to make sure that old growth forest is protected and waterways are restored and so on and so forth.
Yes, definitely. We are definitely telling our story. We're going out into these regional universities and higher education institutions and working with them directly, working with those undergraduates, bringing them out to our homeland and showing them the projects that we have on the ground, letting them know the oral histories that drive those so that they have a little bit of substance behind, why we're doing the things we're doing. But even within higher education, we have a tribal university here, a chapter, Northwest Indian College, and they're wonderful at providing that kind of traditional based education and curriculum that is producing, these students that are, more heavily learned in the way of our culture, traditions, and ecological knowledge than they are the Western science. And so, I think that's as important to marry alongside the Western science so that we continue to have this very rich and robust approach to natural resource policy and management.
James, just tell everybody where the best places are for them to look at what the tribe is doing, their progress, their initiatives, the wildlife division. Give them places where they can go to keep up with this, to get involved. Are there ways for people to get involved to help with, these tribal issues and talk about, restoring lands and the wildlife and things of that sort from the tribal perspective?
Definitely. I mean, if you go to www.nezperce.org, or the Nez Perce Tribe's website. You can dive in, you can do the deep dive into our natural resources departments individually, because they're so vast. In our fisheries, restoration is huge, because there's so much that salmon rely on for their long-term viability. So we have this ridge top to ridge top management paradigm, like from that top of mountain to that top, everything goes to the water. So we have to look to the health of them all. And we go gravel to gravel, from the time that salmon comes out of the gravel to the time it comes back to spawn. We want to be, concerned about its whole life cycle. And so that's how we nurture our salmon along, because that's one of the most important relationships we have. And you can go down the line, with buffalo, with wolves, and see us, striving to expand today to include, those endangered woodpeckers, beavers, insects that are critical for the ecosystem health overall. We're starting to dive into those. We want to produce more milkweed and bring back more monarch butterflies, do our responsibility there. So, we want to do as much as we can for as many species as we can. And yeah, it's a good way to plug in. We have a nonprofit called Nimipu, Protecting the Environment. They do wonderful work. They're often aligned with the tribe as we go forth into the world and do these public advocacy events. And they're great at being a voice for us and being a great voice for wolves and salmon in the water. So there's definitely places to look and to plug in and support us.
I love that you used the phrase plug in. And it's such a thing, I believe, that we are missing, and ecologically and environmentally, we all need to plug back in if we haven't already. James, my last question for you is, when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
Strength, family, responsibility, and nurturing. That's what I think of when I think of the wolf. He's all of those things. He's the most tender caretaker of the people and the strongest warrior for them as well. And I think we'd all be better people if we had a little bit of wolf in us.
James Holt, thank you for this beautiful conversation and this history lesson, and gave hopefully those out there a little bit of hope for the environment going forward and the relationships that we need to have with that. So thank you for your time and chatting with me this morning. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on the show, and I appreciate being here.
Just hang tight while we sign off. Hell's to all out there. We'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer. Thank you for listening.